Joining me now, Vivek Ramaswamy, Doge co-founder and Ohio gubernatorial candidate, which makes me so happy. Vivek, great to see you as always. This is just wild. Just on the kids getting the money, Vivek.
It was wild, Laura, because on one hand, you had kids under the age of 11 getting those checks. On the other hand, you had people above the age of 157 getting those same checks. And here's what they share in common. Neither of them should have been getting it because they probably don't even exist. The reality is much of this fraud can only exist when the government is wasting that level of money. And you and I are all in favor of lifting up kids in this country. But the way to do it isn't through artificial programs that send it to likely made up people in the form of COVID loans that were designed to be given through the Small Business Administration. It doesn't make sense. So I think transparency is a good thing. I don't think that should be controversial. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you deserve to see how your taxpayer dollars are being spent. And I think what we're discovering, Laura, is that a lot of people in the administrative state, in that bureaucracy, have been spending our money, that taxpayer money, as if it's their private piggy bank for their pet causes. And thankfully, it needs to end. But we're also seeing, Laura, that it's not just the bureaucracy. This is going to be one of the top two things that I think comes out of Doge for the long run. It's going to restore accountability to Congress. Because, frankly, there's people in both parties that have been responsible for giving these vast swaths of money to be handed out through the grift that is that bureaucracy. And so I think this is a good development. We should continue to see this level of transparency. Our taxpayers deserve better. And finally, they're just beginning to actually get it.
Well, Vivek, talk to us about these protests that are popping up across the country. We're going to get to the protests, nasty stuff going on at the Tesla dealerships. But just on these pop-up protests on Capitol Hill, it's like they just took the people, the people from the, Code Pink. It's just like an amalgam of the same people. I swear there's some of the same people that you see at other types of protests.
You're exactly right about that, Laura. I was going to say, if you go to New York City and you go to the Dominican Day Parade and then you go to the India Day Parade and then the Ireland Day Parade, it ends up being some of the same people who are professional paraders. And that's fine in the context of a friendly parade. It's like the equivalent of that for these professional protesters. It's a rent-a-protester activity. They may not even know what cause they're fighting for, right? They may be still dated and fighting for a BLM protest because they didn't get the memo that it's 3 years later and now it's supposed to be Doge that you're protesting instead. So it has an astroturf quality to it. And I do think that one of the things we ought to do better is to really engage the best possible arguments for the other side. What you'll discover is many of these rancorous protesters outside, they don't know the first thing about what they're actually protesting for. But that will hopefully cause, if there are those who have better arguments against saving taxpayer dollars away from this waste, fraud, and abuse, if there's good arguments to the contrary, I'd love to hear them. I'm sure you and I both would. We haven't heard them yet, and part of the reason why is the only arguments we've seen so far is trying to shout down the use of actually taxpayer dollars in the right way rather than the wrong way.
Yeah, and again, the administrative state is so big. I mean, this happens during Republicans, Democrats, end of the Trump administration, when all that COVID cash is going out the door. I mean, it's going to happen. Just the sheer size of this government, it has to be reined in just to restore the accountability. But the reasons they cite for being so upset, Vivek, they get very sad, some of the comments, and we need to reach out to these folks. Watch.
The fundamental trend still continues, which is that Doge has created an ethos for the entire federal government, that one of the underlying pillars of the Doge strategy is to create a sense of fear and anxiety among federal workers to drive them out on their own volition.
Fear and anxiety. Look, if you lose your job, it's never fun, right? And I think even stating that compassionately to people. But as Musk said, people are going to have to transition into the private sector. I mean, people lose jobs and move on in all sectors. It's not a guarantee for life that you have a federal job.
I'd root for a lot of those people finding productive work in the private sector. That's a win-win, both for our economy as well as for those individuals and their families. It's less about any individual person and more about the overgrowth of a bureaucracy that needs to be tamed and reined in. You want to hear about anxiety? What I think about anxiety for our kids and their generation, it is a $36 trillion national debt that falls on the shoulders of our kids and their peers. That's what we ought to be anxious about, and we can't stick our heads in the sand, pretend that isn't a real problem, and go about continuing to spend money as though it's really raining from like manna from heaven from on high. That's the way the federal government has behaved for too long. And in fairness, Laura, I think it's worth calling this out. Democrats have been far worse on this score. But this is a bipartisan problem and has been for a very long time. And so one of the ways I hope we're able to say, Democrats, you deserve to benefit from your taxpayer dollars being spent in a better way and deserve that transparency, even if you're a Democrat. And frankly, there are even some Republicans on Capitol Hill for a long time who have been accountable and responsible for that same failure. Take this above the usual partisan tug of war and just get to the core issue of standing for Americans and their taxpayer dollars and defending what's right.
And really quickly, you wrote a great piece about merit pay for teachers dependent on how their students perform. I love this idea.
Yeah.
As Democrats are wailing about cuts to the Department of Education with horrible scores across the country, 4th and 8th graders doing terribly in reading and math. Very, very quickly, why does that matter?
It's a radical idea. I've taken a lot of heat for it as I'm running for governor here in Ohio. Pay for performance in our schools. Here's why it matters. In China, kids are 4 grades ahead of where they are here. In Singapore, they're 5 grades ahead. That means an 8th grader here is the equivalent of a 3rd grader in Singapore. That doesn't work. We've got to turn this ship around, focus on achievement in math, reading, writing, critical thinking, physical education, rather than woke indoctrination. And Laura, for my part, I want to lead Ohio as the state that sets an example for the rest of the country, because this has to be done by the states, not the federal government, to show the rest of the country how we actually compete in the next generation. And we will by paying for performance.
I love it. Vivek, thank you so much. Great to see you as always. We'll see you on the trail. All right.